You wake up inside a silence that feels arranged. Not the peaceful kind, the careful kind. Before dawn on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, royal officers move through the streets of France with sealed orders in their hands. They expect resistance. They expect confusion. They expect to break open doors and find men scrambling ledgers, half-burned treasures, half-buried. What they find instead is something far more unsettling. Empty beds, locked chests, quiet halls. It is as if someone whispered a warning just moments before the knock came. And the question lands with uncomfortable force. Did the Knights Templar receive orders of their own orders that arrived just early enough to change everything? Now the urgency begins to soften. You slow your breathing. The echo of boots on stone fades. The drama recedes just a little like a tide pulling back from shore. What remains is not chaos, but precision. Paper folded carefully. Instructions sealed in wax. Movements timed not to minutes, but to trust. This story does not rush forward. It settles in. It asks you to listen closely to what was said and to what was never written down. You step into a France stretched thin by debt and fear, where the king watches his kingdom like a man counting coins he no longer has. The Templars are everywhere and nowhere at once, bankers without banks, warriors without wars. Their houses look solid, permanent, almost boring. And yet on the eve of their destruction, something changes. You begin to sense it in the air like the moment before a storm when birds vanish and doors quietly close. Somewhere orders are being given, not shouted, not proclaimed. Passed hand to hand, remembered, not recorded. This is where you begin your walk through the final hours before history turns. Not as a judge, not as a treasure hunter, but as a quiet observer following the trail of commands that came too late for some and just in time for others. You will listen for pauses in the records. You will notice who was present and who was inexplicably absent. You will trace how speed, silence, and timing reshaped an entire order overnight. And yes, now and then, you may catch a dry smile at the thought that the most powerful king in Europe may have been outpaced by men sworn to obedience and secrecy. History does enjoy that sort of irony. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You remain in France, but the silence you felt before now reveals its cause. The kingdom is exhausted. By the first years of the 14th century, France is not a realm confidently marching forward. It is a machine grinding under its own weight. Philip IV rules a land strained by war administration and an appetite for order that outpaces its resources. The crown is deeply in debt, not just in the abstract sense scribbled in royal accounts, but in the very real, uncomfortable sense of owing money to an institution that does not kneel. The Knights Templar have become that institution. They hold deposits, manage transfers, and move funds with a reliability that makes kings look clumsy by comparison. This much is not controversial. Royal records, papal correspondence, and surviving financial documents agree that the monarchy's dependence on Templar credit is real, measurable, and growing. What unsettles historians is not the debt itself, but the timing. In the months leading up to October 1307, Philip's court shows signs of tightening rather than loosening. New taxes appear, coinage is debased, officials are reassigned with unusual frequency, as if the administrative board has been shaken and peace is allowed to settle where the king prefers. You can almost feel the kingdom holding its breath, like a man about to plunge into cold water, telling himself it will be quick if done fast enough. Speed here becomes a form of courage or desperation. Sometimes those look identical until much later. there is an obscure but persistent detail that complicates the picture. Around this time, the Crown intensifies audits of religious institutions that are not the Templars. Monasteries are inspected. Accounts are reviewed. Assets are catalogued. On paper, this looks like responsible governance. In context, it resembles rehearsal. Officials are practicing how to seize count and secure property under legal cover. Whether this preparation was meant specifically for the Templars remains debated, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. When the arrests finally come, the machinery does not stall. It runs smoothly as if it has been waiting for a signal. Scholars still argue about motive at this stage. Was Philip driven primarily by financial necessity or by a genuine belief that the order had become dangerous? Some point to his earlier clashes with Pope Boniface VIII and suggest that the king is asserting dominance over all institutions that threaten royal sovereignty. Others argue that belief follows opportunity, not the other way around. When a man owes money he cannot repay, moral clarity has a way of arriving conveniently late. The truth likely lives somewhere in between and refuses to sit still. You recall the empty halls from earlier, the locked chests that greeted the king's officers. That quiet begins to feel less accidental. A kingdom under this kind of pressure leaks in tension. Officials talk, courtiers whisper, servants listen. A plan of this scale cannot be entirely hidden, no matter how sealed the letters may be. Even without explicit warning patterns emerge. Appointments cluster. Movements repeat. The atmosphere changes. It is the political equivalent of watching clouds gather while everyone insists the weather will hold. There is also the matter of timing in a more literal sense. October is not chosen at random. Campaigns have ended. Roads are passable. Harvests are in. Men are home. If arrests are coming, this is when they will work best. The king understands this. So do those watching him. It raises a question that has never been answered cleanly. If the monarchy was preparing so carefully for so long, how did the targets of that preparation remain entirely unaware? Or did they, some historians suggest that the Templars accustomed to royal debt and courtly tension dismissed early signs as routine friction? Others argue the opposite, that the order's leaders read the mood correctly, but underestimated the speed with which the king would move. There is even a minority view that certain Templars believed their indispensability would protect them, that no ruler would dare destroy his own creditors. History, of course, has a cruel sense of humor about such assumptions. As you linger in this moment, the kingdom still holding its breath, one thing becomes clear. The arrests of 1307 are not lightning from a clear sky. They are the release of pressure that has been building quietly, methodically, and visibly to anyone trained to notice. And if that pressure was felt in the royal court, it would have been felt elsewhere too, perhaps, by men accustomed to reading danger, not from proclamations, but from the subtle shifts of power. Whether that awareness hardened into action remains the question that now follows you forward as softly and insistently as footsteps on stone. You begin to notice that long before a single arrest is made, the ground has already been carefully marked. Philip IV does not wake one morning and decide to move against the Templars. That idea belongs to legends, not to administration. What he does instead is far quieter and far more effective. In the weeks leading up to October 1307, royal officials begin appearing in places where they had not lingered before. Bailiffs are reassigned. Seneschals receive new jurisdictions. Men loyal to the crown replace those whose loyalties are merely local. None of this announces itself as a threat. On parchment, it looks like routine governance. In practice, it is the slow tightening of a net. One well-established fact anchors this moment firmly. The arrest orders of October 13th are executed with remarkable coordination across France. That level of synchronization does not happen without rehearsal. Couriers know their routes. Local authorities know their roles. Prison space has already been considered. Chained cells and guards are not improvised overnight. The king has prepared the stage before the curtain ever rises. This is not debated. Even contemporary chroniclers, some hostile to Philip, admit that the operation unfolds with chilling efficiency. What remains unsettled is how early these preparations truly begin. There is an obscure but troubling detail buried in administrative records from the late summer of 1307. Certain royal officers receive instructions to remain unusually close to their posts and to delay travel unless explicitly ordered. The language is vague, framed as a matter of readiness rather than urgency. Yet the timing aligns too neatly with what follows. Some scholars read this as coincidence, a kingdom perpetually on edge. Others see it as the quiet moment when the king ensures his pieces will already be in place when the signal is finally given. You cannot help but recall the pressure building in the court, the held breath of the realm itself. Preparation is how pressure expresses intention. Philip has learned through bitter experience with the papacy and rebellious nobles that speed is the only reliable shield. Legal justification can be assembled later. Confessions can be extracted later. What matters first is control of bodies, buildings, and documents. Delay would mean warning. Warning would mean disappearance. And disappearance would mean failure. There is also the curious matter of secrecy within secrecy. The king does not trust everyone he commands. The arrest orders themselves will be sealed until the final moment, but even the knowledge that something is coming appears to be compartmentalized. A limited circle knows the target. A wider circle knows only that obedience will soon be required. This layered ignorance protects the plan, but it also creates ripples. Men sense when they are being positioned for something unusual. Horses are kept ready. Lodgings are secured. Small deviations accumulate into a pattern. Historians continue to debate whether the Templars could have detected this pattern. Some argue that the order accustomed to operating across borders and courts would have noticed the unusual density of royal attention. Others counter that France is a busy place, and that royal bureaucracy is always shifting. The difference between routine movement and ominous positioning is only obvious in hindsight. At the time, it may have looked like noise rather than signal. Yet hindsight is exactly what troubles this narrative. When arrests come, they do not catch everyone. Some houses appear strangely prepared. Some leaders are absent. Some records are missing. These absences suggest not random luck, but selective awareness. If so, the king's hidden preparations may have been partially visible to those trained to read between the lines. The question is not whether Philip prepared, because he clearly did. The question is whether preparation itself became a form of communication. There is a quiet irony here, one that almost invites a thin smile. A king obsessed with secrecy creates a structure so elaborate that it generates its own shadow. And shadows, once noticed, can be followed. If Philip was racing against time, he may also have been racing against perception. The same efficiency that makes the arrests possible may have given the Templars just enough information to act not boldly, not publicly, but discreetly. As you move forward, the image sharpens. Orders are coming from the crown, but they are not the only orders in motion. Somewhere beyond the reach of wax seals and royal messengers, other decisions may already be unfolding. Whether those decisions were coordinated, improvised, or simply instinctive remains uncertain. What is certain is that by the time the king is ready to strike, he is no longer the only one preparing. You arrive at the moment where preparation becomes action, and everything hinges on paper wax and timing. On the evening of October 12, 1307, sealed letters are placed into the hands of royal officials across France. They are not to be opened, not read, not even hinted at. Each envelope carries the same instruction on the outside commanding obedience under penalty of royal displeasure. The order is simple and absolute. Break the seal only at dawn. What follows the next morning will depend entirely on what those seals conceal. This is one of the clearest facts in the historical record preserved through copies, references, and the consistency of testimony. The arrests happen everywhere at once, or at least as close to once as medieval logistics allow. The precision is staggering. At sunrise on Friday the 13th, doors are knocked upon. In many places they are forced. In others they are opened calmly, almost politely. The letters accuse the Knights Templar of heresy, corruption, and crimes so serious that delay is no longer acceptable. Local officials act quickly as instructed. They seize men. They secure buildings. They inventory what they find. From the king's perspective, the plan works. The order is stunned, decapitated in a single coordinated movement. It is governance as theater, and the curtain rises exactly on cue. And yet the closer you look, the less uniform the scene becomes. Some royal officers report full success, dozens of arrests made before breakfast. Others note strange difficulties. Houses are partially empty. Key figures are missing. In a few places, the arrests feel almost ceremonial, as if both sides are following a script already rehearsed. The sealed letters may have been identical, but their results are not. This unevenness unsettles historians because the king's system is designed specifically to avoid it. If secrecy held perfectly, surprise should have been universal. There is an obscure detail that complicates matters further. Not all letters arrive at the same time. Some officials receive theirs earlier in the night, others later. The difference may only be hours, but hours matter. Medieval roads are slow, but they are not unpredictable. Couriers move along known routes, stopping at known stations. A message delivered early in one town creates a gap, a brief window where knowledge exists in one place and not yet in another. Whether any of that knowledge leaks is impossible to prove, but it is equally impossible to dismiss. You recall the quiet preparations, the sense of held breath that preceded this morning. Now you can almost see how breath turns into motion. Secrecy is maintained through discipline, but discipline depends on people. People talk. They hesitate. They make small decisions that seem harmless in the moment. A courier pauses too long. An official remarks on the gravity of the order. A servant notices the unusual urgency. None of this is proof of warning. All of it is opportunity. Scholars debate whether the Templars could have known the contents of the letters before they were opened. Most agree there is no evidence of direct access, no intercepted document, no betrayed seal. But there is another possibility, more subtle and more unsettling. The very act of distributing sealed letters on this scale may have been visible. Officials gathering, messengers riding through the night, local authorities staying awake instead of sleeping. To an observant eye, something is happening, even if its exact nature remains hidden. There is also the question of tone. The language inside the letters is urgent, uncompromising, and absolute. It allows no discretion. That rigidity suggests fear. The king does not want negotiation. He does not want discussion. He wants compliance before anyone can think. This urgency implies awareness that time is not on his side. You cannot help but wonder why. If the Templars were truly unsuspecting, why the need for such theatrical simultaneity? Why not gradual arrests, easier to manage and less disruptive? The answer may lie not in what the king knows, but in what he fears others might know. As arrests unfold, reports begin to reach the court. Some are triumphant, others are puzzling. Missing commanders, empty strong rooms, records that should be there but are not. The sealed letters have done their work but not perfectly, and perfection was the goal. This discrepancy fuels an ongoing debate. Were these failures simply the result of chance, or do they point to something slipping through the cracks of royal secrecy? You stand in this single morning stretched across an entire kingdom and feel how fragile control truly is. A plan can be brilliant and still incomplete. Orders can be sealed and still sensed. The king has struck with speed and force, but speed cuts both ways. It leaves no time for adjustment, no room for correction. If anyone moved ahead of him, even by hours, the damage is already done. As the sun climbs higher on that Friday, the arrests continue, but the story has already fractured. What was meant to be a clean sweep has become uneven terrain. And somewhere in that unevenness, the possibility emerges that the most important orders of that morning were not the ones opened at dawn, but the ones acted upon before the seals ever broke. You would expect documents that change history to be overflowing with detail. These are not. The arrest orders issued on that October morning are striking not only for what they command, but for what they carefully avoid. They accuse. They authorize. They demand immediate action. Yet they leave wide, deliberate spaces where explanation might normally live. The charges themselves are broad, almost elastic, listing heresy, moral corruption, and secret rites without anchoring those accusations to specific acts or individuals. This is a well-established fact, visible in surviving copies and later references. The king wants compliance, not comprehension. Understanding can wait. Obedience cannot. That absence of detail has troubled scholars for generations. One reason is practical. Local officials are told to arrest, interrogate, and seize property, but they are given little guidance on what to look for beyond people and buildings. There are no lists of forbidden objects, no instructions for handling sensitive documents, no mention of archives, correspondence, or internal records beyond a general expectation that property be secured. In a modern investigation, this would be considered reckless. In 1307, it is either incompetence or confidence. Historians argue about which. There is an obscure interpretation that deserves attention. Some researchers suggest the vagueness is intentional, not merely to speed arrests, but to prevent selective resistance. If officials knew precisely what they were hunting, they might prioritize certain items or tip off those who could hide them. By keeping instructions general, the Crown limits discretion. Everyone grabs everything, or at least tries to. The flaw, of course, is that you cannot seize what is no longer there. And the earlier silences you have noticed now begin to matter. You remember the uneven outcomes from that single morning. Some houses yield records and men, others yield very little. The arrest orders do not account for this variation because they assume surprise will do the work. They assume doors will open onto normality interrupted. But in places where normality has already shifted, where chests are lighter and rooms emptier, the orders suddenly feel blunt, almost clumsy. Another omission stands out. The letters say nothing about coordination between arresting parties after the initial action. There is no guidance on communication once the seals are broken. No instruction to report immediately back to Paris beyond general compliance. This creates a strange silence after the noise of the arrests. Local officials act, then wait. News travels slowly upward, fragmented and delayed. The king, who has controlled timing so obsessively, seems oddly relaxed about information flow once events are in motion. Some historians see this as arrogance, others see it as necessity. Speed has already been spent. Now comes uncertainty. There is also the theological silence. The letters invoke grave religious crimes, yet they offer no supporting evidence, no witnesses, no references to ecclesiastical findings. This absence suggests that the king is acting ahead of formal church process, trusting that papal endorsement can be extracted later. It is a gamble and a risky one. That gamble implies urgency. Urgency implies fear of delay. And delay, as you have already sensed, would have been dangerous if information was already leaking beyond royal control. Here the scholarly debate sharpens. One camp argues that the lack of specificity reflects Philip's confidence that nothing could escape him. The sealed letters, the synchronized dawn, the machinery of arrest, all point to a ruler convinced he has outpaced his opponents. Another camp argues the opposite, that the omissions betray anxiety. The king does not want to narrow his focus because narrowing creates blind spots. Better to cast a wide net and hope whatever matters is caught inside it. You cannot ignore how these silences echo earlier moments, the hidden preparations, the careful positioning of officials, the sealed letters themselves. All are exercises in control through restraint. Say less. Reveal nothing. Act quickly. It is a strategy that works brilliantly against open resistance. It works less well against quiet withdrawal. There is a faint, almost dry humor in this, the sort history enjoys. The king issues orders so general that they can justify anything, yet those same orders are powerless against absence. You cannot arrest a man who is not there. You cannot seize a record that has already been moved. It is like showing up to an ambush only to discover the target left an hour earlier, leaving behind nothing but dust and an awkward sense of timing. As you linger on what the orders do not say, a larger question emerges. Were these gaps merely administrative shortcuts, or do they reflect an assumption that nothing of importance could move without royal notice? If so, that assumption may be the most revealing detail of all. It suggests a ruler who understands force, speed, and secrecy, but underestimates the quiet competence of an order trained for centuries to act without spectacle. The silence inside the orders is not empty. It hums with implication. And that hum grows louder when you consider how much of the story now depends not on what was commanded, but on what may already have been done. The king speaks loudly through accusation and arrest, but in the spaces between his words, another voice may already have finished speaking. You follow the story away from councils and chambers and onto the roads. Because whatever orders were given, royal or otherwise, they did not move by magic. They moved by men on horseback, carrying leather satchels, riding through the dark, with instructions they were not allowed to read. The French royal courier system of the early 14th century is surprisingly effective. This is a solid historical fact. Philip IV maintains a network of messengers capable of covering long distances, quickly changing horses at designated stops, and delivering sealed communications with discipline that borders on obsession. Without this system, the arrests of October 1307 could not have happened as they did. Speed, however, is not silence. Couriers are visible. They arrive late. They leave early. They ask for fresh mounts. They bypass normal schedules. An experienced household notices these things the way sailors notice shifts in wind. The courier does not need to speak for his presence to communicate urgency. And in the days leading up to the arrests, the roads of France see more of these men than usual, riding with purpose, riding with priority. Officially, this is invisible. Practically, it is anything but. There is an obscure and often overlooked detail hidden in later testimonies. Several royal messengers report being instructed to avoid unnecessary conversation and to accept no hospitality beyond what was essential. That instruction sounds mundane until you remember how medieval travel works. Messengers typically rely on inns, monasteries, and private households. Refusing conversation is unusual. Refusing hospitality is suspicious. Silence in this context becomes louder than speech. Some historians suggest this instruction reflects fear of interception. Others argue it reveals concern about being observed too closely. Either way, the crown appears acutely aware that movement itself can betray intent. You think back to the sealed letters waiting for dawn. Those letters do not appear from nowhere. They travel. They pass through hands. Each transfer is a potential fracture point. The king tries to minimize those fractures by insisting on discipline, but discipline cannot erase human perception. A courier arriving hours earlier than expected creates a ripple. A courier staying unusually close to his horse creates another. These ripples overlap. Scholars disagree on whether any of this amounts to warning. One view insists that even if the Templars noticed increased messenger traffic, they could not have known its purpose. Courts generate paperwork constantly. Another view counters that the Templars, as administrators and bankers, are unusually sensitive to bureaucratic rhythms. They understand when paperwork behaves oddly. To them, a surge in royal communication might feel less like noise and more like a signal. There is also the uncomfortable matter of overlap. Royal couriers do not travel in isolation. They share roads with merchants, pilgrims, clergy, and servants. News does not need to be explicit to travel. A comment about urgency, a remark about sealed instructions, a refusal to stop where one normally would. None of this violates orders, yet all of it transmits mood. Anxiety is contagious. Urgency leaks. You may allow yourself a small smile here because history loves this irony. The king designs a system meant to outrun awareness, only to rely on the most visible method of communication available at the time. Horses are fast, but they are not discreet. If secrecy were a whisper, couriers are the footsteps echoing down the corridor afterward. And echo they do. Some researchers push the argument further, suggesting that certain couriers may have carried more than one message or more than one meaning. There is no direct evidence of betrayal, but there is debate about discretion. Couriers are not monks. They are men paid for loyalty, not sanctity. Whether any of them chose to hint, warn, or simply hesitate remains an open question. The records are silent, which is either reassuring or deeply suspicious depending on your temperament. What matters more than individual betrayal is cumulative effect. A system designed for speed produces patterns. Patterns can be read. Earlier you sensed preparation as a form of communication. Here that idea gains weight. Movement becomes message. Silence becomes signal. The couriers do not need to announce the arrests for the world to feel something approaching. There is also timing to consider. Some arrest orders arrive very late at night, others closer to dawn. That variation creates a staggered wave of activity. In places where orders arrive early, officials have time to react emotionally before acting. In places where they arrive late, action is immediate, but questions linger afterward. This unevenness may explain why some Templar houses appear untouched, as if the moment passed before the knock ever came. As you walk these roads in your mind, listening to hooves on dirt and stone, you begin to understand that information does not move only through words. It moves through rhythm, through deviation, through repetition. The royal couriers are the bloodstream of the operation, but blood carries signals as well as sustenance. If the kingdom was holding its breath, These riders were the pulse that gave it away. And so the possibility sharpens. The king may have controlled the letters, the seals, and the timing, but he could not fully control perception. Somewhere between one relay station and the next, between one refusal of wine and the next urgent request for a fresh horse, the shape of something coming may have become visible. Not clear, not specific. Just enough to make careful men do what careful men have always done when the air changes. They prepare. You begin to sense that awareness does not arrive all at once. It creeps in. Long before doors are struck and seals are broken, there are signs that some within the order are no longer behaving as men who believe tomorrow will look like yesterday. This is not speculation without footing. A well-established fact anchors the unease. In the weeks before October 1307, several Templar houses show reduced activity in their formal records. Fewer transactions, fewer acknowledgements, fewer routine entries than normal. Medieval institutions loved paperwork, the way modern offices love email, and when the paperwork thins, it usually means attention has shifted elsewhere. What scholars disagree on is why. One explanation insists this is coincidence, the natural ebb of an organization nearing the end of a financial quarter or preparing for seasonal transitions. Another interpretation, more controversial, suggests intentional restraint. Write less, record less, leave fewer traces. In an era where written records are power, silence can be protective. This idea remains debated because intention is difficult to prove, and historians are trained to be suspicious of patterns discovered only after catastrophe. Still, the pattern refuses to disappear. You remember the couriers riding through the night, the kingdom tightening the letters sealed and waiting. Awareness does not require full knowledge. It requires discomfort. And discomfort, once shared, has a way of spreading quietly through trusted channels. The Templars are not a loose fraternity. They are a disciplined order accustomed to reading danger in subtle shifts. These are men who have survived ambushes, betrayals, and political reversals across continents. It would be strange if they suddenly became oblivious to tension at the very heart of the kingdom they serve. There is an obscure detail buried in later testimony that adds weight to this idea. During interrogations, some Templars remark that the arrests were not entirely unexpected. They do not say they knew the date. They do not claim to have seen the orders. They speak instead of an atmosphere, a sense that hostility had sharpened. Critics argue these statements are retrospective self-defense, a way to appear composed rather than caught off guard. Supporters counter that consistency across multiple accounts suggests something more than bravado. The order's structure matters here. Communication within Templar networks is hierarchical but efficient. Messages travel through trusted channels, often orally, often framed as routine guidance rather than alarm. A command to review inventories. A reminder to ensure documents are in order. A suggestion to delay travel or consolidate resources. None of this announces danger. All of it prepares for it. If awareness existed, it likely wore the mask of normality. You also begin to notice who is quiet in the sources. Certain regional leaders leave fewer traces in the weeks before the arrests. Their absence from correspondence is not proof of flight, but it is noticeable. Some historians believe these men were simply occupied elsewhere. Others suggest they may have chosen to step away from visibility. In a world without instant communication, absence can be both innocent and strategic. The difference often depends on timing, and here the timing is uncomfortable. There is room for gentle irony. The Templars are accused of secrecy as a crime, yet secrecy has been their profession for generations. They move money invisibly. They protect roots and people without fanfare. Expecting them to behave loudly in the face of danger would be like expecting a locksmith to panic when he hears a key turn. If anything, discretion would be the instinctive response. The scholarly debate circles one persistent question. Awareness of what exactly? Knowing that pressure exists is not the same as knowing that arrests are imminent. Some argue the Templars believed negotiations would prevail, that royal hostility would resolve through compromise or papal mediation. Others argue that certain leaders may have suspected a decisive break was coming, even if the form remained unclear. The difference between those beliefs would shape behavior profoundly. You recall the earlier gaps, the uneven arrests, the missing figures. These begin to feel less like anomalies and more like consequences. Awareness does not guarantee escape. It guarantees choice. Stay, leave, reduce exposure, preserve what matters, sacrifice what can be lost. These are decisions made quietly, often without consensus, often under uncertainty. They leave behind a trail that looks centuries later like coincidence unless you know where to look. There is also the matter of trust. Who would be warned if warning existed? Not every knight, not every house. Information shared too widely becomes noise. If awareness moved through the order, it likely followed lines of confidence rather than rank alone. That selective flow would explain why some houses appear untouched, while others collapse instantly. It would also explain the enduring silence afterward. Men who survive by discretion do not advertise how they did it. As you stand on this threshold just before the storm breaks, awareness feels like the wrong word. It is too sharp, too conscious. What emerges instead is something softer and more dangerous. Intuition. A sense that the ground is no longer stable, that doors may soon open for reasons that have nothing to do with hospitality. And when intuition speaks especially to men trained in patience, the response is rarely dramatic. It is quiet preparation. And that quiet now is beginning to make sense. You begin to notice movement where stillness should have been. In the late summer and early autumn of 1307, certain Templar houses behave as though they are preparing for a change that has not yet been announced. This is not a matter of rumor or legend. Surviving records, sparse though they are, show unusual internal transfers. Men are reassigned without clear external cause. Supplies shift locations. Horses appear where there is no scheduled journey, then vanish again. These are small things easy to overlook unless you already suspect that something is wrong. Historians agree on the movements. What they do not agree on is why they happened. One well-established fact grounds the discussion. The Templars are meticulous administrators. Their houses operate on predictable rhythms shaped by prayer, finance, and logistics. When those rhythms change, it usually means a directive has been issued. And yet no surviving order explains the shifts seen just before October 13th. That absence creates an uncomfortable vacuum, one that has been filled with speculation for centuries. An obscure but compelling detail emerges when you look closely at inventories taken after the arrests. Some houses list fewer weapons than expected. Others show reduced stores of coin or plate. Importantly, these are not the richest houses nor the poorest. They are often strategically placed along routes or near ports, places where movement would be easier to conceal. Critics argue that losses could be due to theft, misrecording, or the chaos of arrest. Supporters counter that the pattern appears too consistent and too well-timed to be accidental. You remember the thinning records, the intuition spreading quietly through the order. Movement is what intuition becomes when it acts. If awareness existed, even in an imprecise form, the logical response would not be mass evacuation. That would be obvious and dangerous. The response would be selective adjustment. Shift what matters. Reduce exposure. Make the house look normal while quietly changing what normal contains. There is a light, almost wry humor here, the kind that only appears in hindsight. Imagine royal officials bursting in confident. They have arrived unannounced, only to find that the cupboards are technically full, but somehow not quite right. It is like searching a desk for an important document and discovering that everything is present except the one page you needed. History does enjoy that sort of petty frustration. The debate intensifies when scholars examine the timing of these movements. Some transfers appear to occur weeks before the arrests, others mere days. This staggered pattern resists a single explanation. It suggests not one command, but a series of judgments made locally, perhaps in response to shared unease rather than explicit instruction. That distinction matters. A centralized evacuation would leave a clear trace. A decentralized response leaves ambiguity, which is exactly what the sources offer. You also notice that not all houses move in the same way. Some shift personnel, others adjust finances, others show no obvious change at all. This variety argues against panic and in favor of discretion. Panic looks chaotic. This looks considered. Each house responds according to its vulnerabilities and strengths. A house near a river prioritizes records. One near a border prioritizes men. One near nothing at all does very little and hopes for the best. It is not strategy in the grand sense. It is survival thinking. There is an ongoing scholarly question that refuses to settle. Were these movements ordered from above, or did they emerge organically? Those who favor central coordination point to the order's discipline and hierarchy. Those who favor local decision-making point to the lack of a single pattern and the absence of any surviving command. Both camps agree on one thing. Something changed before the arrest, and that change left physical traces. You recall the sealed letters waiting for dawn, the couriers riding with unnatural urgency. If even a fraction of that urgency was sensed by the Templars' movement, would be the safest response. Words can be overheard. Letters can be seized. Movement, if done quietly and plausibly, leaves far less behind. A man reassigned is not a confession. A chest moved is not a crime. Only later do these things begin to look like preparation. There is also the human element often overlooked. Templar houses are not abstract units. They are communities. Men live, eat, and pray together. If a commander grows uneasy, that unease transmits itself without instruction. Someone suggests securing documents. Someone else volunteers to escort supplies elsewhere. No one says why. No one needs to. In tight-knit groups, silence often carries more authority than speech. You allow yourself another small smile here, because this is where grand conspiracies usually fall apart. There is no dramatic midnight meeting, no unanimous vote, just a series of small decisions, each reasonable on its own, that collectively change the outcome. It is history by accumulation rather than design. When the arrests finally come, royal officials interpret what they see through the lens of accusation. Missing items become proof of guilt. Empty rooms become evidence of flight. From their perspective, this makes sense. From yours, standing earlier in the timeline, it looks more ambiguous. It looks like men responding to pressure without knowing exactly what form that pressure will take. The unusual movements do not prove foreknowledge of arrest. They do not require secret orders whispered in the dark. They require only awareness that the ground is shifting and the discipline to act without announcing that you have noticed. Whether that awareness came from the king's preparations, the courier's urgency, or the general tightening of the realm remains unresolved. What is clear is this: By the time the knock comes, some houses are no longer what they were meant to be. They are lighter, quieter, less vulnerable. And that change, subtle as it is, reshapes everything that follows. You turn now toward a man who should have been at the center of everything and yet seems curiously distant from the storm. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, is in Paris in the days leading up to the arrests. This is not speculation. It is firmly established fact. He attends public ceremonies. He participates in courtly life. He walks the streets of the capital without guard or urgency. Most strikingly, he is present for the funeral of Catherine de Courtenay on October 12th, standing alongside the very king who will order his arrest hours later. If there were secret warnings circulating widely, his behavior appears to contradict them. And yet, contradictions are where this story thrives. De Molay's surviving correspondence from this period is sparse, almost unsettlingly so. The Grand Master of a vast international order leaves behind remarkably few written instructions from his final weeks of freedom. Some historians interpret this as innocence, even naivety. They argue that de Molay believed negotiations with the papacy would resolve tensions, and that his presence in Paris reflects confidence rather than blindness. Others read the silence differently. They suggest that if sensitive messages existed, they may have been deliberately kept off parchment. There is an obscure but persistent detail that complicates the picture. In later testimonies, several Templars claim they had received guidance from leadership shortly before the arrest's instructions framed as routine reminders rather than alarms. Maintain discipline, ensure obedience, avoid unnecessary attention. On their own, such phrases mean very little. In context, they begin to feel heavier. Critics dismiss these statements as retrospective invention shaped by years of imprisonment and interrogation. Supporters note their consistency across regions and ranks, a consistency that is difficult to fake under pressure. You remember the unusual movements in the houses, the selective adjustments that suggest localized decision-making. If messages came from the Grand Master, they likely did not take the form of explicit warnings. A direct alert would have been dangerous and, more importantly, unverifiable. Anyone claiming to carry it could be dismissed as a provocateur. But a shift in tone, a subtle emphasis on readiness, could travel safely through trusted channels. De Molay's position makes this plausible. He is not merely a commander, he is a symbol. His words carry weight even when they say very little. A reminder to uphold the rule could be read as business as usual or as a call to caution, depending on the listener's sensitivity. In an order trained to read nuance, that ambiguity may have been intentional. The scholarly debate sharpens around a troubling question. If de Molay sensed danger, why remain in Paris? One answer suggests miscalculation. He may have believed his visibility would protect the order, that arresting him openly would provoke outrage or papal resistance. Another answer suggests sacrifice. By staying put, he draws attention to himself, leaving others less scrutinized. This interpretation is controversial, bordering on romantic, but it persists because it fits the uneven outcomes that follow. There is also the possibility that de Molay knew less than we expect. Central leadership does not always have the clearest view, especially when information is compartmentalized. Earlier you noticed how preparation can generate awareness without clarity. De Molay may have sensed hostility without grasping its immediacy. In that case, his messages, if they existed, would reflect caution rather than alarm. History rarely grants leaders perfect information at the moment it would be most useful. You may allow yourself a dry aside here. There is something almost tragically bureaucratic about the idea that the head of one of the most powerful orders in Europe might miss the final memo. Not because he is foolish, but because the system itself has grown too complex to whisper clearly. Empires fall that way more often than we like to admit. What remains undeniable is this: when arrests come, de Molay is caught. Others are not. That imbalance forces interpretation. Either the Grand Master failed to warn effectively, or he warned in a way that favored discretion over survival at the center. Both possibilities reshape how you understand the Order's final days. As you stand with him in Paris the night before the knock, the contrast is striking. Around him, movement has already begun elsewhere. Houses are adjusting. Records are thinning. Men are quietly stepping aside. And here he is, visible, public, almost serene. Whether this reflects confidence, misjudgment, or deliberate misdirection remains unresolved and likely always will. What you can say is this: if messages from the Grand Master existed, they were not meant to save everyone. They were meant to preserve something. What that something was, whether people, principles, or resources, is a question that now follows you forward into the empty spaces left behind when leadership and survival part ways. You begin to notice that danger rarely announces itself with new language. It hides inside familiar phrases. In the months before the arrests, Templar administrative directives continue to circulate, and on the surface they appear unremarkable. Houses are reminded to maintain discipline. Accounts are to be kept orderly. Travel is to follow established permissions. These are the sorts of instructions that belong to any large institution attempting to keep itself from fraying at the edges. This is a well-established fact, supported by surviving fragments of internal correspondence and later testimony. Nothing in these words screams emergency, and yet that is precisely what makes them interesting. Because tone matters as much as content. Several historians have noted subtle shifts in emphasis within these routine orders. The language grows firmer. The reminders repeat more often. There is an increased stress on obedience to immediate superiors rather than distant authority. Individually, these changes mean very little. Collectively, they begin to resemble guidance for navigating uncertainty. It is not that new rules appear. It is that old rules are suddenly underlined. An obscure and debated interpretation suggests these routine messages functioned as coded preparation. Not codes in the cinematic sense with hidden symbols and secret alphabets, but codes of familiarity. Within an order trained to follow structure, repetition itself can be instructive. When a superior reminds you twice to secure records, the second reminder carries weight that the first does not. Skeptics argue this is overreading bureaucratic habit. Supporters counter that in hierarchical organizations, emphasis is rarely accidental. You recall the earlier thinning of formal records and the unusual movements within houses. Routine orders provide the framework that makes those actions legitimate. A man does not need to be told to hide something if he has already been reminded to safeguard it. He does not need to be told to leave if he has been instructed to minimize exposure. In this way, ordinary language creates extraordinary flexibility. It allows action without explicit instruction, which is safer for everyone involved. There is a gentle irony here that almost invites a quiet chuckle. Royal investigators later combed through Templar documents looking for proof of conspiracy, while the most effective guidance may have been hiding in plain sight, filed under normal operations. History once again prefers subtlety to spectacle. The scholarly debate here centers on intentionality. Did leadership deliberately adjust tone to prepare the order for risk, Or are historians projecting coherence onto what is simply routine administration? Those who argue for intention point to timing. The emphasis sharpens as royal pressure sharpens. Those who argue against it point out that organizations under stress often become more rigid reflexively without conscious strategy. Both positions are reasonable. Neither resolves the question completely. You cannot ignore how this connects back to the sealed letters and the courier's urgency. The king relies on secrecy and shock. The Templars, if they sense danger, rely on familiarity and habit. One side acts loudly for a single morning. The other acts quietly over weeks. These approaches collide, not because one is smarter, but because they operate on different timescales. There is also the matter of plausible deniability. If arrests come and no danger materializes, routine orders leave no trace of panic. If arrests come and danger is real, those same orders suddenly look prescient. This ambiguity protects leadership, whether intentionally or not. It is difficult to punish a man for reminding his subordinates to do their jobs properly. It is much harder to accuse him of forewarning. You think again of Jacques de Molay in Paris, visible and calm. If he communicated anything, it would have had to survive scrutiny, interception, and misinterpretation. Routine language does all three. It passes through hostile hands without raising alarm. It reassures the anxious. It gives the attentive something to work with. It is the perfect tool for an order that values obedience and subtlety over improvisation. There is a quiet, almost sleepy humor in imagining royal officials poring over stacks of parchment, convinced that secrets must look secret. Meanwhile, the most consequential guidance may have been hiding in the dullest phrases imaginable. Secure the house. Maintain order. Follow the rule. Medieval equivalents of telling everyone to back up their files and lock the door on the way out. As you linger with these documents, the pattern becomes clearer. No dramatic warning is necessary if everyone already understands the environment. Routine orders become a shared language for unspoken concern. They allow each house to interpret risk according to its circumstances, producing the varied responses you have already seen. Some move men. Some move money. Some do nothing and hope. This is why later attempts to reconstruct the final instructions struggle. Investigators search for a single message that explains everything. What they encounter instead is a mosaic of ordinary guidance applied under extraordinary pressure. The pieces fit, but only if you accept that preparation does not always look like planning. The clues hidden in routine orders do not prove foreknowledge of arrest. They do something more interesting. They show how an institution can prepare for danger without admitting even to itself that danger is coming. And in a world where saying the wrong thing at the wrong time could destroy you, that kind of quiet readiness may have been the only sensible choice. You arrive at the place where the logic falters and the silence becomes hardest to explain. The Paris commandery should have been the safest place in France. It sits near the center of royal power, close to courts, churches, and constant scrutiny. If warnings were circulating, if awareness was spreading, this is the house you would expect to be most prepared. And yet when the arrests come, Paris offers almost no resistance. Jacques de Molay is there. Senior officers are there. Records are there. The heart of the order is exposed, waiting almost obligingly. This is not disputed. Contemporary accounts and royal inventories confirm that the Paris commandery is taken cleanly, efficiently, and almost theatrically. That fact has never sat comfortably with the rest of the evidence. You have already seen signs of adjustment elsewhere. Houses thinning quietly. Men absent at precisely the wrong moment. Chests lighter than expected. All of that makes Paris feel like an exception rather than a rule. The question then is not why some houses appear prepared, but why this one does not. The answer you choose reshapes the entire story. One interpretation suggests that Paris was never meant to be protected. The commandery's visibility makes secrecy impossible. Any sudden movement of men or goods would have drawn attention. Royal eyes are everywhere here. Courtiers gossip for sport. Servants listen for a living. If you wanted to conceal preparation, Paris is the worst possible place to do it. Better to leave it untouched, unchanged, convincingly normal. There is a strange logic to this. You do not hide in the brightest room. You let the light blind your observer. An obscure but telling detail adds weight to this view. Later, royal inventories from Paris are unusually thorough compared to those from provincial houses. Officials list objects carefully, almost obsessively, as if determined to demonstrate success. Some historians suggest this reflects relief rather than confidence. Paris must look like a victory, because if it does not, questions will follow. If the center is empty, the entire operation looks compromised. You recall the routine orders and the emphasis on discipline. Paris may have been instructed implicitly to remain stable, to hold, to present continuity. In a network responding quietly to pressure, someone must absorb the blow. Someone must appear unsuspecting. That role, unpleasant as it is, falls naturally to the center. Another interpretation is less generous. It argues that de Molay and the Paris leadership genuinely misread the danger. They believed negotiation would prevail. They trusted proximity to power. They assumed that no king would risk such a public rupture without warning. History offers plenty of examples where proximity to power creates blindness rather than clarity. The closer you stand, the more normal everything looks. Storms feel distant when you are inside the palace. There is a dry amusement here, if you allow yourself one. It is the administrative equivalent of thinking your office job is secure, because your desk is near the boss's door right up until the entire department is eliminated. Location, it turns out, is not destiny. Scholars remain divided. Those who see sacrifice point to the uneven outcomes elsewhere. Those who see miscalculation point to de Molay's behavior, public and calm, almost stubbornly. So, both sides ask the same question from different angles. If warnings existed, why did they not protect Paris? If no warnings existed, how do you explain the preparedness elsewhere? You also begin to notice what Paris lacks. There are no reports of unusual movements here in the weeks before the arrests. No thinning of personnel. No gaps in accounting. It is as if the commandery has been frozen in time, preserved precisely so it can be seized intact. That absence of absence is itself a presence, and it speaks loudly. There is an unresolved scholarly debate about whether Paris functioned as a decoy intentionally or not. Not in the sense of a dramatic ruse, but as a psychological anchor. Royal planners expect the order's center to matter most. If they secure it, they assume the rest will follow. Meanwhile, attention focuses inward, while outward movement goes unnoticed. Whether the Templars exploited this assumption consciously or benefited from it, accidentally remains open. You think back to the couriers, the sealed letters, the emphasis on speed. The king is racing information. Paris is where information pools. If anything was going to be watched carefully, it was this house. That makes it the least flexible node in the network. In systems under pressure, flexibility migrates to the edges. The center hardens. And when the blow comes, the hardened center cracks first. There is also the human cost, which history often smooths over. Men in Paris are arrested, imprisoned, and interrogated. Some will not survive the process. If sacrifice played a role, it was not symbolic. It was real, borne by individuals who may or may not have understood why their house remained unchanged, while others quietly adapted. This is not noble tragedy. It is institutional triage. As you stand in the courtyard of the Paris commandery, hearing the echo of boots and the scrape of chains, the contradiction sharpens rather than resolves. Either the order failed here, or it chose not to succeed. Both possibilities are unsettling. Both fit the evidence imperfectly. And perhaps that is the point. History rarely offers clean explanations when human beings are forced to choose between visibility and survival. What Paris represents in the end is not ignorance or foresight, but constraint. It is the place where preparation is hardest, where discretion is least effective, and where the cost of doing nothing is indistinguishable from the cost of doing something. The rest of the order may have shifted quietly, but here silence could not move. It could only wait. You begin to notice that the kingdom fractures the moment the arrests begin. On paper, the operation is uniform. The sealed orders are identical. The accusations are the same. The dawn is shared. Yet as reports filter back, a pattern of inconsistency emerges that no amount of royal confidence can smooth over. In some regions, the arrests are swift and thorough. In others, they are partial, awkward, or strangely hollow. This unevenness is a well-established fact, preserved in royal correspondence and later summaries of the operation. The king's net catches many fish, but not all, and certainly not evenly. What unsettles historians is how predictable the failures appear after the fact. In parts of northern France, especially near major roads and ports, officials arrive to find fewer men than expected. Senior figures are missing. Houses are staffed, but lightly. In more isolated regions, arrests proceed almost too well, as if the Templars there had neither the means nor the warning to adjust. This contrast raises a troubling question. If surprise was absolute, why does it fail more often where movement is easiest? An obscure but revealing detail complicates matters further. Some local officials report confusion about jurisdiction delays in assembling guards, or uncertainty about the scope of their authority. These are not excuses invented centuries later. They appear in early administrative records written by men eager to justify their performance. Such hesitation costs time. Time allows decisions, and decisions, even small ones, change outcomes. Scholars debate whether these delays were systemic or situational, but their impact is undeniable. You recall the couriers riding through the night and the staggered arrival of sealed letters. That uneven timing now looks less trivial. A town where orders arrive early experiences hours of anticipation. A town where they arrive late experiences only urgency. In the first case, word can spread without words. In the second, action replaces reflection. This difference alone could explain why some houses seem prepared and others do not, without requiring any dramatic conspiracy. There is also the matter of local relationships. Templars do not live in isolation. They lend money. They provide protection. They employ servants. In some regions, they are resented. In others, they are quietly valued. A local official, tasked with arresting men he knows personally, may hesitate if only briefly. That hesitation does not look like resistance. It looks like procedure. But it buys time, and time here is everything. A controversial interpretation suggests that certain arrests fail because the targets are already gone. Not fleeing in panic, but simply absent, reassigned, or engaged elsewhere. Critics argue this is coincidence amplified by hindsight. Supporters point out that absence clusters in particular regions rather than appearing randomly. This clustering fuels ongoing debate. Is it evidence of selective preparation, or merely the statistical noise of a large operation? You think back to the Paris commandery, frozen and exposed. That immobility now contrasts sharply with the edges of the network. The farther you move from the center, the more variation you find. This aligns with systems theory more than conspiracy. Central nodes are rigid. Peripheral nodes adapt. No one needs to issue a single unified warning for this to happen. Pressure alone can produce it. There is a moment of dry humor here because bureaucracy rarely admits its own limits. The king designs an operation assuming uniform compliance across a diverse landscape. Reality, as usual, declines the invitation. Local terrain, local personalities, and local timing intervene. The result is not failure, but imperfection. And imperfection leaves gaps. Scholars continue to argue about how much these discrepancies matter. One camp insists that the majority of Templars are arrested, proving the operation's success. Another points out that success is not binary. If the goal includes securing leadership records and assets, then partial success may conceal deeper failure. The fact that royal inventories later complain about missing items suggests disappointment rather than triumph. You also notice how these discrepancies shape the narrative afterward. Where arrests succeed cleanly, accusations harden quickly. Where they falter, suspicion grows. Missing men become presumed guilty. Empty rooms become evidence of flight. The unevenness of the operation feeds the mythology of escape, even where escape may not have occurred. History once again fills silence with meaning. There is an unresolved question that continues to divide scholars. Were these regional differences anticipated by the crown, or did they come as a surprise? If anticipated, they suggest a calculated acceptance of loss in exchange for speed. If surprising, they reveal a blind spot in royal planning. Either answer has implications. One paints the king as ruthless but realistic. The other paints him as confident to the point of miscalculation. You recall the emphasis on speed over legal certainty. That choice now echoes through the discrepancies. Speed magnifies inequality. It rewards preparedness, whether intentional or instinctive. It punishes hesitation, whether moral or logistical. The arrests succeed not where the king is strongest, but where his timing aligns with local conditions. As you move through these regions in your mind, the story becomes less about a single command and more about a cascade of moments. A delay here, an absence there, a relationship remembered, a horse not yet saddled. None of these require secret orders to matter. Together they shape outcomes that look centuries later like design. The discrepancies do not prove that the Templars knew exactly what was coming. They do suggest that when pressure builds across a system, responses diverge. Some freeze, some flex, and in that divergence, the mystery deepens. If the arrests were meant to be final, why do they leave behind such uneven ground? And if uneven ground remains, what moved through it before the dawn that no order ever recorded? You now arrive at the most unsettling testimony of all. Not what people claim to have seen, but what they insist was not there. In the days following the arrests, witnesses are questioned about what they observed inside Templar houses. Their answers, recorded in legal summaries and later inquiries, reveal a strange consistency. Doors were locked, halls were quiet, rooms were orderly. Beds looked slept in but recently vacated. Chests were present but unremarkable. In multiple locations, officials remark on the absence of chaos. This is a well-established historical fact. Arrests do not uncover scenes of panic or hasty flight. They uncover calm. That calm is difficult to explain. If the Templars were completely unaware, one might expect confusion. If they were forewarned in a dramatic sense, one might expect disorder. Instead, witnesses describe spaces that feel paused, as if activity had simply stepped out for a moment. Historians have long debated this atmosphere. Some argue it reflects discipline, the product of an order trained to receive authority without protest. Others argue it reflects preparation, a stillness chosen rather than imposed. An obscure detail deepens the puzzle. In several testimonies, witnesses note that lamps were extinguished properly, valuables were secured according to routine practice, and communal spaces were left clean. These details are small but revealing. Panic leaves mess. Carelessness leaves traces. What remains here suggests intentional closure. Critics counter that this could simply reflect normal monastic orderliness. Supporters respond that the timing is too precise. These houses look not merely orderly, but finished. You remember the unusual movements, the thinning records, the routine orders that carried heavier weight than their words suggested. Seen through that lens, these empty spaces feel less accidental. They look like places that have already completed whatever internal adjustments they intended to make. The arrests interrupt nothing urgent. They arrive after something has already concluded. There is a quiet, almost unsettling humor here. Royal officers burst in expecting revelation only to find tidiness. It is the medieval equivalent of raiding an office after hours and discovering that everyone backed up their files and logged out properly. No notes left on desks, no secrets taped under drawers. Just absence, polite and frustrating. The scholarly debate here centers on interpretation rather than fact. Did witnesses see nothing because nothing happened, or because whatever happened left no visible trace? Those who argue for innocence emphasize that absence is not evidence. Those who argue for preparation note that absence can be engineered. The disagreement persists because both sides can point to the same rooms and draw opposite conclusions. You also begin to notice who these witnesses are. They are not neutral observers. They are royal officials, clerics, and local figures operating under instruction. Their language is cautious. They describe what they can prove, not what they suspect. This restraint shapes the record. If a room feels wrong but looks normal, it is recorded as normal. Medieval testimony favors the tangible over the intuitive. There is another unresolved question woven into these accounts. If warnings existed, why leave anything at all? Why not strip houses bare? The answer may lie in credibility. Empty buildings provoke questions. Orderly ones reassure. A house that looks lived in yesterday and abandoned today appears less suspicious than one clearly evacuated. Leaving behind furniture, tools, and routine objects preserves the illusion of continuity. It suggests interruption rather than foresight. You recall the Paris commandery frozen in place and the regional discrepancies elsewhere. These witness accounts bridge the two. They show how preparation does not always announce itself through dramatic absence. Sometimes it hides in careful presence. Leave enough behind to look normal. Remove only what matters. Trust that no one will know the difference until much later. There is a subtle irony worth acknowledging. The very discipline that makes the Templars effective bankers and administrators also makes them frustrating subjects for investigation. They leave behind spaces that resist interpretation. Investigators want signs of guilt or innocence. What they get is tidiness, and tidiness refuses to testify. Historians continue to argue about whether these witnesses unknowingly describe the aftermath of quiet instruction. Some suggest that the order's rule itself prepared members to respond to crisis with calm withdrawal. Others insist that this reading romanticizes what is simply the result of hierarchical obedience. Again, the truth likely sits somewhere between unmoved by certainty. As you move through these silent halls in your mind, the absence begins to speak. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently. Something has already happened here. Not a flight, not a panic, not a confrontation. A decision, a closing of doors, a choice to leave nothing that would explain itself easily. The witnesses who saw nothing may be the most honest narrators of all. They tell you exactly what they found. And what they found in its ordinariness suggests that the most important actions of those final days left no footprints at all. You turn from rooms and people to something far less forgiving. Numbers. Financial records do not panic. They do not forget. They stop only when someone decides they should. And in the months just before October 1307, a curious pattern emerges across several Templar houses. Account books that had been maintained with almost ritual consistency simply end. Not gradually, not with explanation. They stop mid-cycle. This is a well-established historical fact, visible in surviving fragments and noted in later royal audits. For an order defined by financial precision, this silence is extraordinary. Historians agree on the stoppage. They disagree on its meaning. One interpretation suggests disruption. As pressure mounted, normal operations faltered. Scribes were reassigned. Priorities shifted. In a period of uncertainty, record-keeping may have suffered. This explanation has the advantage of simplicity, but it struggles to explain the consistency of timing. The breaks cluster close to the arrests, not spread randomly across the year. Chaos usually leaves uneven traces. This looks deliberate. An obscure but much discussed detail sharpens the issue. In several houses, outgoing transactions cease before incoming ones do. Money arrives but is not redistributed. Debts are acknowledged but not settled. It is as if the order pauses its outward financial presence while maintaining internal awareness. Critics argue this could reflect logistical delay. Supporters counter that it resembles containment. Hold what you have. Limit exposure. Wait. You recall the routine orders emphasizing discipline and safeguarding. Financial records are more than bookkeeping. They are maps of relationships. They reveal who owes whom, where assets move, and which routes matter. If danger is sensed freezing, the map makes sense. You do not update directions when you suspect the map itself may be seized. There is also the question of missing ledgers. Royal officials complain repeatedly in later correspondence that certain records cannot be found. This is not rumor. It is frustration written in ink. They know something should exist because previous references point to it. Yet when they search, the trail ends. Some historians believe these ledgers were destroyed in haste. Others argue they were relocated quietly. The difference matters. Destruction is panic. Relocation is planning. You allow yourself a small, tired smile here because anyone who has ever dealt with auditors knows how powerful a missing document can be. No accusation stings quite like the records are incomplete. Medieval kings are no different. The absence of financial clarity haunts Philip's efforts long after the arrests are complete. The scholarly debate circles a central question. Did the cessation of records represent an attempt to hide wrongdoing or an attempt to protect legitimate operations from seizure? Those inclined toward guilt see concealment. Those inclined toward caution see defense. Both sides point to the same silence and hear different things. That is the danger of numbers. When they stop speaking, everyone else speaks louder. You think back to the empty halls described by witnesses. Financial silence fits that same pattern. Nothing is torn. Nothing is burned in sight. Things simply end. The order does not erase its past. It stops adding to it. That distinction is subtle but crucial. It preserves continuity while limiting vulnerability. There is also an unresolved question of authority. Who decides to stop the books, a local commander, a regional superior, or is the decision implied, inferred from tone rather than ordered outright? If the latter, it reinforces the idea that preparation moved through the order without explicit commands. Everyone understands when to stop writing, just as everyone understands when to lower their voice. The timing remains the most uncomfortable element. These stoppages do not align with festival seasons or known administrative cycles. They align with pressure, with couriers riding harder, with royal scrutiny intensifying, with that held breath you sensed earlier across the kingdom. It is difficult to believe this alignment is accidental, yet impossible to prove it is intentional. You also notice what happens afterward. Once arrests begin, financial records resume only under compulsion, rewritten from memory, reconstructed under interrogation. These new records lack the quiet confidence of the originals. They are defensive, incomplete, and shaped by fear. The earlier silence now looks less like failure and more like a final intact moment preserved before everything fractures. As you step away from the numbers, the pattern grows clearer. Movement in houses, silence in records, calm in rooms, absence in leadership. None of these proves foreknowledge alone. Together, they suggest an institution shifting into a protective posture without declaring an emergency. It is how experienced systems respond when they sense danger but lack certainty. The financial records that suddenly end do not tell you what the Templars knew. They tell you when they chose to stop leaving trails, and that choice made quietly and unevenly may be the closest thing to an order that ever existed. You might expect the Church to speak first. After all, the accusations leveled against the Templars are spiritual in nature. Heresy, blasphemy, corruption of sacred rites. These are not minor administrative complaints. They strike at the core of medieval identity. And yet, in the weeks before the arrests, the Church is remarkably quiet. This silence is not imagined. It is a well-established historical fact that no public ecclesiastical inquiry precedes the king's action. No synod convenes. No warnings are issued from the pulpit. No formal denunciation circulates among bishops. The storm breaks without a bell being rung. That absence has puzzled scholars for centuries. One explanation argues that Philip moves faster than the Church can react. Papal machinery is slow, cautious, and weighed down by legal formality. The king, by contrast, is unburdened by patience. He arrests first and negotiates later. This interpretation fits Philip's temperament and his earlier clashes with papal authority. Yet it raises a problem. If the Church truly knows nothing, why does it offer so little resistance once the arrests begin? An obscure but important detail complicates the picture. Several high-ranking clerics appear informed enough to adapt quickly after the fact. Papal correspondence shifts tone with unusual speed. Initial skepticism gives way to conditional cooperation. This transition is too smooth to be entirely improvised. Some historians argue that informal channels were already active, that concerns had been voiced privately, even if they never reached parchment. Others insist this is simply the Church choosing pragmatism once confronted with a fait accompli. You recall the routine orders, the emphasis on safeguarding the thinning of records. Ecclesiastical silence fits that same pattern. Silence does not mean ignorance. It can mean hesitation or calculation. The Church, like the Templars, understands the danger of committing too much to writing at the wrong moment. Spoken concern leaves no archive. Silence leaves options. There is also the delicate matter of jurisdiction. The Templars answer directly to the Pope, not to kings or bishops. Any formal investigation would require careful legal framing. Launching it prematurely risks legitimizing royal interference. Waiting preserves authority. That waiting, however, creates a vacuum. And vacuums invite decisive men with armies and sealed letters. A light, almost weary humor slips in here. Imagine the ecclesiastical inbox of 1307, complaints piling up, tensions noted, everyone agreeing something should probably be done eventually once the paperwork is ready. Meanwhile, the king has already scheduled dawn. Scholars debate whether the Church's silence contributed to Templar awareness. Some suggest that the absence of reassurance was itself a signal. In a world where institutions constantly talk, sudden quiet feels ominous. If bishops are not defending the order publicly, perhaps defense is no longer assumed. Others argue the opposite, that the Church's restraint lulled the Templars into a false sense of security. If Rome is calm, why panic? You think back to Paris, to Desmoulins' public confidence. That confidence may have rested on papal process. Negotiation takes time, law takes time. The king's arrests shatter that assumption. They also expose a rift between spiritual authority and temporal power that no one fully controls. The Church does not lead, it reacts, and reaction by definition comes too late. There is an unresolved scholarly question here that refuses to settle. Did ecclesiastical silence protect the Templars by allowing quiet preparation, or did it doom them by delaying visible opposition? The evidence supports both readings uncomfortably well. Silence can shelter. Silence can isolate. Which it does depends entirely on who fills the space. You also notice how this silence shapes later narratives. Once confessions begin, once charges are formalized, the Church's earlier quiet disappears beneath a flood of procedure. Trials convene, questions are standardized, records multiply again, as if to compensate for the earlier void. The moment for subtlety passes. Everything becomes loud, written, and irrevocable. As you linger just before that shift, the quiet feels heavy rather than empty. The Church does not warn, it does not condemn, it waits, and in waiting it allows the king's urgency to define the tempo. If the Templars sensed this imbalance, if they felt the absence of ecclesiastical intervention, as a warning sign it would have reinforced every other signal you have traced. Couriers ride harder, records grow sparse, houses adjust. And the Church, usually so vocal, says nothing at all. Sometimes silence is not neutrality. It is the sound of institutions deciding who will move first. In 1307, the king does not wait to find out what silence means. He acts, and everyone else, including those sworn to spiritual authority, spends the following years trying to explain why they did not speak sooner. You begin to understand that this story is not only about power, but about speed. Philip IV is not merely executing an arrest. He is racing something he cannot fully see: information, rumor, perception. Once a plan like this exists, its greatest enemy is time. Every hour before dawn is an opportunity for something to slip loose: a word, a movement, a decision that cannot be undone. This urgency is a well-established feature of the operation. The king insists on simultaneity not for spectacle, but for containment. He is trying to outrun awareness. That urgency explains much of what has already puzzled you. Why sealed letters are opened at dawn rather than delivered openly. Why officials are forbidden from acting early. Why accusations are broad and instructions rigid. These are not the choices of a man confident that his secret will hold indefinitely. They are the choices of a man who suspects it will not. Historians often frame Philip as calculating and cold, but calculation does not exclude anxiety. In fact, anxiety sharpens calculation. There is an obscure but revealing detail in the king's own correspondence after the arrests begin. He repeatedly emphasizes speed when addressing allies and subordinates. He urges immediate action, rapid interrogation, swift securing of property. This insistence does not fade once the Templars are in custody. If anything, it intensifies. Some scholars see this as momentum. Others see it as fear that the initial blow did not land as cleanly as hoped. You recall the discrepancies, the missing commanders, the empty halls. These are not minor leaks. They are signs that information may have moved faster than the king intended. The race, it seems, was close, and close races leave winners nervous. There is also the matter of international reach. The Templars are not confined to France. They operate across Europe and beyond. Once arrests begin, news will travel outward, carried by merchants, clergy, and frightened men who slip through the net. Philip knows this. He moves quickly to pressure other rulers, urging them to follow his lead. This is not confidence. This is containment. He is trying to ensure that what begins as a French operation does not become a French embarrassment. A faint, almost ironic humor appears here. The king, obsessed with control, is forced to trust that everyone else will move as quickly as he does. History rarely rewards that kind of optimism. Some rulers comply. Others hesitate. Some investigate. Others wait. The very diversity of response undermines the illusion of a single unified narrative. Scholars debate whether Philip overestimated his advantage. One view holds that he acted just in time, preventing the order from executing a broader escape or consolidation. Another suggests he was already late, that key elements had slipped beyond reach before the first door was struck. The evidence allows both readings, which is precisely what makes the question enduring. You think back to the couriers, the visible urgency, the discipline that could not hide movement. The king's race against information may have been compromised by the very tools he used to run it. Speed creates noise. Noise creates awareness. Awareness creates choice. And choice is the one thing a coordinated arrest cannot tolerate. There is also the psychological dimension. Acting quickly allows Philip to frame the narrative. Accusation precedes defense. Shock precedes doubt. But shock wears off. Once the initial wave passes, questions surface. Why were some houses empty? Why are records missing? Why do confessions vary so widely? These questions grow louder the longer the process drags on. Speed wins the opening move, not the entire game. As you follow this race, the picture becomes clearer. The king is not reacting to certainty. He is reacting to risk. The risk that the Templars, disciplined and perceptive, have already begun to adapt. Whether that adaptation was planned or instinctive matters less than the fact that Philip behaves as if it is possible. His actions betray his fear more clearly than any confession ever could. By the time dawn breaks on October 13th, the race is technically over. The arrests begin. But the outcome remains unresolved. Information continues to move now in fragments, in rumors, in absences. The king has struck first, but striking first does not guarantee striking fully. As you stand at this moment watching urgency collide with preparation, one thing becomes unmistakable. The events of 1307 are not the result of a single order overpowering another. They are the result of two systems accelerating simultaneously, each trying to outrun the other. One relies on seals and force. The other relies on intuition and quiet adjustment. And in races like that, the finish line is rarely where anyone expected it to be. You feel the moment when the story crosses borders and control begins to loosen. Once the arrests begin in France, the silence does not hold for long. News moves outward, carried not by royal couriers this time, but by the older, less predictable networks of medieval Europe. Merchants talk, clergy whisper, servants travel. The fact is clear and well established. Outside France, the response to the arrests is slower, uneven, and far less enthusiastic. Some rulers hesitate, some doubt, some simply wait. The king's urgency does not translate cleanly beyond his reach. That delay matters. In places like England, the Iberian kingdoms, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, Templars are not immediately seized. Days pass, weeks in some cases. This is not because orders are unknown, but because certainty is missing. Foreign rulers receive accusations without evidence, urgency without explanation. They are asked to move quickly, yet they see no local crisis demanding speed. Scholars agree that this hesitation creates space, but they argue fiercely about what fills it. One interpretation suggests that the Templars abroad benefit from nothing more than political caution. No ruler wants to act rashly against a powerful military order without clear justification. Another interpretation is more provocative. It suggests that by the time news arrives, some Templars have already adjusted their posture. Not fleeing dramatically, not vanishing wholesale, but stepping aside, consolidating, blending back into local rhythms. The same quiet instinct you have seen inside France may now be operating in slower motion. There is an obscure detail that keeps returning in these debates. In several regions, foreign authorities report difficulty locating specific individuals named in French correspondence. The houses exist, the brothers exist, but certain figures are absent or difficult to identify. Critics argue this reflects poor record-keeping or confusion over names. Supporters counter that absence clustering around leadership roles suggests something more intentional. Once again, the evidence resists certainty. You recall how speed shaped outcomes inside France. Here, speed dissolves. The king's race against information slows as geography intervenes. Mountains, seas, and politics stretch time. The sealed letter tactic cannot be repeated at this scale. Warnings, rumors, and interpretations arrive together, tangled and loud. The shock of dawn becomes the murmur of debate. There is a gentle, almost sardonic humor in this. Philip attempts to impose a single tempo on Europe, and Europe responds with its natural rhythm. Councils convene. Letters are discussed. Opinions are weighed. In the time it takes to decide, reality changes. Men relocate. Documents are secured. Options multiply. History's great enemy from the perspective of sudden power is deliberation. Scholars continue to argue about whether any coordinated response existed beyond France. Some see evidence of improvisation rather than planning. Others point to the order's transnational experience and argue that adaptability itself is coordination. You do not need a central command if everyone understands the environment. Pressure teaches faster than instruction. You think back to the routine orders, the emphasis on safeguarding the intuition spreading quietly. Those habits do not stop at borders. A Templar in England understands tension in France even before official news arrives. Trade networks transmit mood as effectively as information. If the center has been struck, the edges feel it. They may not know how, but they know enough to pause to watch to avoid standing too still in the open. There is also the matter of reputation. Outside France, the Templars are not universally resented. In some regions, they are respected, even protected. Local rulers hesitate to destroy institutions that serve them well. That hesitation buys time. And time, as you have seen repeatedly, is the most valuable resource in this story. An unresolved scholarly question persists. Did any Templars escape entirely because of this delay, or did they simply face arrest later under different circumstances? The records offer partial answers at best. Some men disappear from the sources altogether. Others reappear years later, folded into new orders or secular life. Whether these disappearances represent deliberate escape or the natural erosion of documentation remains hotly debated. As you stand at the edge of France, watching the shock waves spread outward and weaken, the pattern feels familiar. The king's plan is designed for simultaneity. The world refuses to cooperate. Once time stretches, so does possibility. The arrests succeed spectacularly in one place and imperfectly everywhere else. Foreign responses do not undo what happens in Paris. They do not rescue the order, but they reveal something essential. Whatever the Templars knew, whatever they sensed, it did not end at the border. Awareness travels, caution adapts. And when power moves faster than information in one place, it almost always moves slower than information somewhere else. That imbalance leaves traces. Not dramatic escapes, not heroic stands. Just a series of quiet survivals that never announce themselves clearly enough to become legend. And perhaps that is why centuries later you are still following them, trying to see what moved through the gaps left behind when a kingdom tried to act faster than the world would allow. You begin to sense that not all warnings need language. In an order built on discipline and shared habit, silence itself can become instruction. Long before modern communication theory gave it a name, medieval institutions understood something fundamental. When writing becomes dangerous, behavior speaks instead. This is not conjecture. It is a well-established historical fact that many medieval organizations relied heavily on non-written cues, especially when operating under scrutiny. The Templars, trained to function across hostile territories, would have been particularly adept at this. The question is whether such signals were in play during those final days. There is no surviving message that says, "Prepare yourselves." No coded letter has been discovered. No witness reports a dramatic warning whispered in candlelight. And yet patterns suggest coordination without correspondence. Houses that had no reason to communicate suddenly behave in compatible ways. Records thin, movements align. Certain individuals are absent at exactly the wrong moment. These are not instructions you can intercept. They are decisions you can only notice afterward. An obscure but provocative detail surfaces in later testimony. Some Templars describe changes in daily routine shortly before the arrests. Prayer schedules adjust slightly. Meals are taken earlier or later than usual. Watchfulness increases without explanation. Critics argue this reflects heightened tension, nothing more. Supporters suggest it reflects recognition. In communities bound by routine altering, that routine is a signal that something has shifted, even if no one says what. You recall the emphasis on routine orders and the weight they carried. When ordinary structure tightens, it draws attention without drawing suspicion. A commander who insists on stricter observance of rules may appear pious or cautious, not alarmed. Yet within the order, that insistence communicates seriousness. It says without saying that this is not the moment to drift. There is also the matter of timing. Some houses reduce activity just enough to look unremarkable. Others do nothing visible at all. This variation has puzzled historians, but it fits the logic of nonverbal signaling. Signals do not dictate identical outcomes. They prompt assessment. Each house reads the environment and responds according to its exposure. One locks down records. Another ensures key men are elsewhere. Another decides that visibility is safer than movement. All respond to the same pressure without receiving the same instruction. A gentle aside suggests itself here. It is rather like a modern office when management stops sending cheerful emails and starts scheduling brief check-ins. No one needs a memo to understand that something unpleasant is approaching. The meeting invite is the message. Medieval life had fewer calendars, but the principle holds. The scholarly debate centers on intentionality once again. Were these signals deliberately employed by leadership, or did they emerge organically as shared anxiety spread? Those who argue for intent point to the order's long experience operating under threat. They suggest that leaders knew exactly how to tighten behavior without creating evidence. Those who argue against intent note the absence of uniformity and warn against turning instinct into conspiracy. Both sides agree on one thing. If signals existed, they were effective precisely because they were deniable. You think back to the king's race against information. Non-written signals move faster than couriers and leave nothing to seize. They do not require secrecy because they look like normal life. A house that prays more carefully is not guilty of anything. A brother reassigned for mundane reasons raises no alarm. Only later, when patterns are assembled, does meaning emerge. There is an unresolved question that refuses to settle. If signals were used, who initiated them? Was it central leadership, regional commanders, or simply the accumulation of shared unease? The sources do not allow a definitive answer. They do allow possibility. And possibility in this case explains more than certainty ever could. You also notice how these silent signals align with earlier observations. The courier's urgency, the thinning records, the uneven arrests, all suggest that information traveled without words, not as a message, but as a mood. When institutions sense danger, they do not need instructions to adapt. They need only permission to take their instincts seriously. There is a subtle irony worth savoring. The accusations against the Templars focus on secret rituals and hidden knowledge. Yet the most effective secrecy on display here is utterly mundane. No symbols, no codes, just ordinary behavior adjusted slightly, like a door closed a fraction earlier than usual. The kind of secrecy that leaves investigators staring at tidy rooms and wondering why nothing makes sense. As you sit with this idea, the story feels less like a thriller and more like a study in human systems. Words fail under pressure. Habits endure. When the written world becomes dangerous, people fall back on what they know how to do without explanation. That is not conspiracy. It is adaptation. By the time dawn arrives on that Friday, whatever signals existed have already done their work. They have not saved everyone. They were never meant to. They have simply allowed some decisions to be made quietly, without creating a trail that could be followed. And that perhaps is why the historical record feels so unsatisfying. You are not missing the document that explains everything. There never was one. The signals without words do not tell you exactly what the Templars knew. They tell you how they behaved when knowing too much would have been dangerous. And in that behavior, understated and ordinary, you may be seeing the closest thing to an order that history will ever allow. You now arrive at the absence that refuses to be explained away. When the arrests unfold, it is not only rooms that are empty. Certain men are missing. Not junior brothers on errands. Not servants overlooked in the confusion. Senior figures. Commanders whose presence should have been routine, expected, even unavoidable. This is a well-established historical fact, drawn from arrest rolls and later complaints by royal officials. Names appear on lists of those to be seized, yet the bodies themselves are nowhere to be found. Absence here becomes evidence without clarity. Some historians argue that these missing commanders are simply elsewhere on legitimate business. The order is vast, Travel is constant. Leaders move between houses to inspect, negotiate, and administer. This explanation is reasonable and in many cases likely correct. But it falters when timing is considered. The clustering of absences around the very moment arrests are ordered strains coincidence. Men can be away by chance. Many men away at once invites a different reading. An obscure but persistent detail deepens the puzzle. In several regions, replacements are present and active just before the arrests. Authority has been delegated quietly. This is not extraordinary in itself. Delegation is normal practice. What unsettles scholars is the lack of documentation explaining why it happened then. Orders change hands without a paper trail, as if the transfer itself were meant to be temporary, deniable, or simply invisible. You recall the routine orders and the emphasis on discipline and hierarchy. Delegation fits comfortably within that framework. A commander can step aside without signaling alarm, framing his absence as duty rather than flight. To an outsider, nothing is wrong. To those inside the structure, authority continues uninterrupted. This is not disappearance. It is continuity without visibility. There is also the matter of where these men are not found. They do not reappear in prison registers. They are not listed among the early interrogations. Some resurface years later in different contexts. Others vanish from the record entirely. Scholars argue fiercely over what this means. One camp suggests these men escaped and lived quietly under assumed identities, or within other institutions. Another insists the records are simply incomplete, eroded by time rather than intention. You think back to the uneven arrests and the regional discrepancies. Missing commanders align neatly with places where outcomes are partial rather than total. Where leadership is absent, arrests capture fewer men and fewer resources. Where leadership is present, houses fall cleanly. This correlation does not prove planning, but it does suggest that leadership presence mattered profoundly in shaping events. There is a dry, almost uncomfortable humor here. The king's orders aim to decapitate the order. Instead, in some places, the head is already gone. Not cut off in a dramatic gesture, but simply not in the room when the blade swings. History has a way of undermining metaphors like that. Scholars continue to debate whether any central instruction encouraged commanders to remove themselves from danger. Those who argue for it point to the order's experience with crisis management. Those who argue against it note the lack of uniformity. Some commanders are caught, others are not. If there were a plan, it was imperfect. If there were no plan, the pattern is oddly selective. Both readings leave residue. You also consider human psychology. Leaders often sense danger before their subordinates do. They attend courts, they hear rumors, they notice shifts in tone. If awareness existed anywhere, it would have existed here. That awareness need not produce a dramatic escape. It might simply prompt a delay in returning home, a decision to remain on the road, a choice to let a deputy handle local affairs for a while longer. None of this requires a warning to be spoken aloud. There is an unresolved scholarly question that continues to divide opinion. Did missing commanders represent the survival of institutional memory or its loss? If they escaped, they carried knowledge with them. If they vanished into obscurity, that knowledge may have dissolved anyway. Either way, their absence weakens the Crown's ability to reconstruct what happened before the arrests. You cannot interrogate a man who is not there. You recall the witnesses who saw nothing, the rooms left orderly and calm. Missing commanders fit that same aesthetic. Nothing dramatic, nothing chaotic. Just an absence that feels intentional only because of its timing. The kind of absence that leaves investigators with lists instead of answers. There is also a moral ambiguity here that historians rarely enjoy confronting. If some leaders chose to avoid arrest, they did so knowing others would not. This is not heroism. It is triage. Institutions under existential threat make choices that individuals later struggle to justify. Survival rarely distributes itself evenly. As you linger with these missing figures, the story grows quieter rather than louder. There is no triumphant escape. No secret convoy slipping into legend. Just men who are not where they are expected to be at the one moment when being expected becomes dangerous. That absence may be the clearest sign yet that something was understood even if it was never articulated. The missing commanders do not tell you what orders were given. They tell you what decisions were made. And decisions, unlike orders, do not require documentation. They require only timing opportunity and the willingness to accept consequences that others will bear. By the time the arrests are complete, the damage is done. The order is broken publicly. Privately, pieces remain scattered, silent, and frustratingly unreachable. And somewhere within those missing spaces, the final instructions may have done exactly what they were meant to do, not by saving the institution, but by ensuring that not everything it was would be captured at once. You now encounter the voices the king believed would explain everything. Under interrogation, the Templars speak, sometimes freely, sometimes under pressure that bends truth into shapes no one can trust. Confessions emerge, recantations follow, contradictions multiply. This much is uncontested. Yet within this tangled record lies a detail that continues to trouble historians. Some confessions contain an odd absence. They do not describe shock. They do not dwell on disbelief. Instead, they move quickly past the moment of arrest, as if it confirmed something already suspected, rather than revealing something new. This pattern is subtle but persistent. Several Templars, when recounting their capture, speak in tones that suggest expectation rather than astonishment. They do not say they were warned. They do not claim knowledge of the date. They simply describe the event without emotional emphasis. Critics argue this is an illusion created by interrogation transcripts, shaped by clerks rather than speakers. Supporters counter that emotional flattening appears across regions and circumstances, which is difficult to attribute solely to scribal habit. You remember the witnesses who saw nothing, the calm rooms, the tidy spaces. Emotional restraint fits that same texture. Panic leaves language. Calm leaves summary. When a man is surprised, he explains it. When a man is not, he moves on. This does not prove foreknowledge, but it suggests familiarity with risk. There is an obscure but revealing detail buried in several testimonies. Some Templars refer to accusations as inevitable rather than unexpected. They speak as if the trial itself is the problem, not its arrival. This phrasing has divided scholars sharply. One camp argues it reflects resignation born during imprisonment. The other suggests it reflects earlier awareness that hostility had reached a breaking point. Again, timing is everything. Words spoken months later may echo thoughts formed much earlier. You think back to the ecclesiastical silence, the tightening royal posture, the routine orders carrying extra weight. In that environment, inevitability becomes a rational expectation. If everyone senses pressure building arrest, feels less like an ambush and more like a release. That emotional framing would shape how men later described the moment, even if they lacked concrete knowledge. There is also the question of performance. Confessions are not private diaries. They are responses shaped by survival. A man who presents himself as unsurprised may appear stoic, obedient, even virtuous. A man who claims shock may appear naive or defensive. Under interrogation, self-presentation matters. This complicates interpretation. Are these men revealing truth or crafting it? A dry aside fits here. Medieval interrogations, like modern job interviews, reward composure even when everything is going wrong. Panic convinces no one. Calm at least suggests control. Whether that calm existed before arrest or was learned afterward is impossible to disentangle. Scholars continue to debate whether these confessions preserve traces of earlier expectation. Some argue that shared language emerges not from shared knowledge but from shared experience of captivity. Others note that certain phrases appear too early, too close to the arrests, to be entirely shaped by later suffering. The record refuses to settle. You also notice what these confessions do not emphasize. They do not dwell on warning signs. They do not mention unusual movements. They do not describe signals without words. This silence may reflect caution rather than ignorance. Admitting preparation could be interpreted as guilt. Silence protects even under questioning, especially under questioning. You recall the missing commanders, the leaders who are not there to confess at all. Their absence shapes the record profoundly. Those who speak are often not those who decided. The narrative of surprise or acceptance is built from voices left behind, not from those who stepped aside earlier. That imbalance matters. It tilts interpretation toward endurance rather than strategy. There is an unresolved scholarly question that continues to hover over these testimonies. Do they reflect memory or do they reflect adaptation? Human beings reinterpret past events constantly, especially under trauma. A moment that once felt confusing can later feel inevitable. That transformation may occur unconsciously. By the time a man speaks, he may genuinely believe he was never surprised, even if he once was. As you sit with these confessions, the emotional temperature of the story cools further. No dramatic cries, no sudden revelations, just voices trying to survive in a world that has already decided their fate. In that context, the absence of surprise may say less about what the Templars knew beforehand, and more about how thoroughly they had internalized the sense that something was wrong. Yet the pattern remains. Too many voices, too little astonishment. Too much calm and recollection. Combined with everything you have already traced, it becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence alone. The confessions do not announce forewarning. They whisper familiarity. And familiarity in moments like this is rarely accidental. Whether these men sensed arrest as destiny or simply learned to narrate it that way afterward remains unresolved. But the effect is the same. The king seeks explanations and finds composure instead. He looks for shock and finds acceptance. And in that emotional mismatch, another clue emerges. Whatever the final orders were, they did not teach the Templars how to escape interrogation. They taught them how to endure it. You begin to see that loss in this story is not evenly distributed. When royal officials inventory what they have seized, the results are puzzling. Some houses yield modest treasures. Others yield surprisingly little. A few offer up enough to satisfy expectations while leaving unanswered questions about what should have been there. This is a well-established historical fact, preserved in royal complaints and post-arrest assessments. The crown expects a financial windfall. What it receives is uneven, occasionally disappointing, and often difficult to reconcile with what is known of the order's wealth. The question is not whether something was lost, but how. One interpretation insists that chaos explains everything. Arrests disrupt operations. Guards mishandle property. Records are incomplete. Valuable items vanish in the confusion, stolen by opportunists rather than hidden by design. This explanation has merit. Medieval law enforcement is not known for delicacy. Yet it struggles to explain why losses cluster around specific categories. Portable wealth disappears more often than immovable property. Records vanish more often than furniture. Men are missing more often than buildings. An obscure but telling detail sharpens the debate. In several inventories, officials note the presence of everyday items in abundance, while remarking on the absence of things that would normally anchor authority. Seals, correspondence, internal ledgers, and certain ceremonial objects are often unaccounted for. Critics argue this reflects poor searching or ignorance of what to look for. Supporters counter that it reflects prioritization. Someone knew what mattered. You recall the routine orders emphasizing safeguarding the thinning financial records, the unusual movements in houses. Seen together, these patterns suggest selection rather than scatter. What remains behind is replaceable. What disappears is not. This is not the behavior of men fleeing blindly. It is the behavior of an institution deciding under pressure what can be sacrificed. There is a quiet, almost practical humor in this. Anyone who has ever moved offices under threat of downsizing knows the instinct. You leave the chairs. You save the files. You do not carry the desk out the door. Medieval or modern survival favors portability. Scholars continue to argue about whether the order could have acted so deliberately under uncertainty. One camp suggests that without clear warning, such selectivity would be impossible. Another counters that selectivity does not require certainty, only suspicion. When risk rises, institutions fall back on hierarchy of value. They protect identity before comfort, memory before display. You also notice regional variation again. Houses near borders or ports show greater loss of portable assets. Inland houses show less. This correlation fuels debate. Is it evidence of escape routes being used or simply coincidence shaped by geography? The sources allow both readings. What they do not allow is indifference. Something shaped these outcomes. You think back to the missing commanders. Leadership absence aligns uncomfortably well with selective loss. Where leaders are present, seizures are more complete. Where leaders are absent, inventories feel thinner. This does not prove orchestration, but it does suggest that leadership presence influences what survives. Decisions, whether made earlier or in the moment, leave material traces. There is also the matter of time. Arrests occur quickly, but inventories take longer. Days pass between seizure and accounting. In that interval, movement is possible. Guards rotate. Officials change. Property shifts hands. Critics argue that this gap explains everything. Supporters reply that the gap exists everywhere, yet losses are not uniform. Again, pattern resists simplification. An unresolved scholarly question persists. Were certain losses intentional sacrifices meant to satisfy royal appetite while preserving more sensitive assets? Or were they simply the byproduct of a system collapsing under force? The answer matters because it reframes the order's final actions. Either they acted strategically under duress, or they were overwhelmed and bled unpredictably. You recall the witnesses who saw nothing and the confessions that describe inevitability rather than shock. Those voices suggest composure rather than collapse. Composure makes selective loss plausible. Panic does not. There is also the afterlife of what was saved. Some records resurface decades later in unexpected places. Some financial practices reappear under new institutional names. These echoes are faint and fiercely debated, but they suggest continuity rather than annihilation. If everything had been lost, nothing would have remained to echo. As you weigh what was saved against what was lost, the story grows less dramatic and more human. Institutions under threat do not choose perfectly. They choose quickly. They misjudge. They protect what they can. The result is not a clean ledger, but a patchwork of absence and presence that frustrates those who arrive later expecting clarity. The king wants proof of total victory. He wants a reckoning that balances. What he gets instead is ambiguity. Some things are gone, some remain, and no inventory can explain why. In that imbalance, you glimpse the final shape of the order's response. Not a grand escape, not a tragic stand, but a series of choices made under pressure, guided by instinct, habit, and hierarchy of value. The most important question is no longer whether orders existed, but whether they needed to. When danger is sensed, institutions often act without instruction, saving what defines them and letting the rest fall away. What was saved, what was lost, and what was never counted at all, now carry the same weight. Together, they form the quietest answer yet to the mystery you have been following. Whatever the last orders were, they did not aim for survival without cost. They aimed for survival with memory intact. You step back now, far enough to see the shape of what the king achieved and what slipped past him. By any immediate measure, the operation of October 1307 succeeds. Hundreds of Templars are arrested. Their leadership is publicly humiliated. Their houses are seized. Their reputation is shattered beyond quick repair. This is a well-established historical fact. Philip IV accomplishes what no ruler before him had managed. He breaks the most powerful military religious order in Europe in a single stroke. If history stopped here, the story would be simple. It does not. As royal reports accumulate, cracks begin to appear. Officials praise their efficiency, but their language betrays irritation. They note missing men, incomplete records, assets that should be present but are not. These complaints are not marginal. They appear repeatedly and with increasing sharpness. The king has won decisively, but not completely. That distinction matters more than it first appears. One obscure but revealing detail emerges from later correspondence. Royal administrators begin asking questions they should not need to ask if everything has gone according to plan. Where are certain documents? Why do inventories vary so widely? Why do some houses yield so little? These are not philosophical inquiries. They are logistical frustrations. And frustration suggests expectation unmet. You recall the emphasis on speed over certainty. Speed delivers bodies and buildings. It does not guarantee comprehension. The arrests overwhelm the order, but they do not illuminate it. The king captures the visible structure while struggling to grasp what animated it. That gap between capture and understanding becomes the operation's quiet failure. There is a dry, almost rueful humor here. Philip seizes the chessboard and congratulates himself only to realize that several key pieces are no longer on it. He still wins the game, but he never quite understands how it was played. Scholars debate whether these failures are significant or inevitable. One camp argues that no medieval operation of this scale could ever be airtight. Losses are normal, imperfections expected. Another camp counters that the very ambition of the operation makes its shortcomings meaningful. When you plan for simultaneity and secrecy, any deviation becomes a signal. The king wanted finality. What he achieved was dominance with residue. You think back to the missing commanders, the selective losses, the quiet adjustments. These are not the signs of an order escaping intact. They are the signs of an order shedding parts of itself under pressure. From the king's perspective, this is still victory. From an institutional perspective, it is partial survival. There is also the political dimension. Philip must convince others that he has acted justly and thoroughly. Inconsistencies undermine that narrative. If some Templars are missing, suspicion spreads beyond guilt to competence. If assets are unaccounted for, questions arise about motive. The king compensates by pushing harder, expanding accusations, and leaning into confession. The louder the story becomes, the less attention is paid to what remains unresolved. An unresolved scholarly question continues to hover here. Did Philip recognize these failures as they occurred, or only later some evidence suggests early awareness? His rapid efforts to internationalize the arrests look like damage control as much as expansion. He needs others to move quickly before alternative narratives take root. Speed once again becomes his answer to uncertainty. You also notice how success and failure blur together. The order is destroyed publicly, yet its knowledge, practices, and perhaps even people disperse rather than vanish. This is not failure in a conventional sense. It is incomplete annihilation. History is full of such outcomes where institutions die loudly but persist quietly. There is a human element worth lingering on. Royal officials on the ground likely believed they had done their jobs well. They followed orders. They arrested men. They sealed buildings. They sent reports. And yet those same reports become evidence of imperfection. It is an uncomfortable position, familiar to anyone who has executed a plan, only to be told later that what was missing mattered more than what was done. As you weigh the successes against the failures, the mystery sharpens rather than resolves. If the king had truly caught the order unaware, the outcome would look cleaner. If the order had truly foreseen everything, the outcome would look emptier. What you see instead sits in between. Enough success to claim victory. Enough failure to leave questions unanswered. That middle ground is where the final orders, if they existed, would have done their work. Not by preventing arrest, not by preserving power, but by ensuring that when the hammer fell, it did not crush everything at once. Something escaped, not in legend, not in treasure, but in continuity. The king breaks the institution he can see. He fails to capture the institution as it understands itself. And that may be the most enduring tension of all. Victory without understanding leaves a long shadow. Philip wins the moment. History keeps asking what he missed. As you move forward, the shape of that shadow becomes clearer. The story is no longer about whether the arrests worked. They did. It is about whether they worked completely. And in that distinction lies the final reconstruction, the attempt to piece together what was decided quietly and imperfectly before the dawn ever arrived. You are now close enough to the center of the mystery to feel its shape, even if you cannot touch it. By this point, you have gathered fragments rather than commands. Movements without memos. Silences without explanation. Decisions without documentation. If final instructions were given, they did not survive as text. What survives instead is behavior. And behavior, when examined carefully, can be assembled into something resembling intent. Start with what repeats. Records thin, but not everywhere. Leaders are absent, but not all. Assets vanish selectively. Houses remain orderly. Confessions show composure rather than shock. Each element alone explains little. Together, they suggest a pattern of restraint rather than reaction. Not panic, not flight. A measured narrowing of exposure. Whatever instructions existed, they did not call for escape. They called for adjustment. This is a well-established point of agreement among many modern scholars, even those who disagree on motive. The order does not behave like an institution caught unaware, nor does it behave like one executing a grand centralized plan. It behaves like a system responding to threat without certainty. That distinction matters. It changes how you reconstruct what might have been said. An obscure but valuable insight comes from comparative analysis. When other medieval institutions face sudden danger, their responses tend toward extremes. Either they collapse into chaos, or they fortify openly. The Templars do neither. Their response is muted, distributed, almost invisible. This suggests instructions framed not as emergency orders, but as permission. Permission to prioritize. Permission to delay. Permission to leave things unfinished. You recall the routine orders, the emphasis on discipline and safeguarding. Those messages did not need to change dramatically to take on new meaning. A reminder to secure records becomes a prompt to move them. A suggestion to limit travel becomes an opportunity to remain away. A call for obedience becomes a reason to accept delegation. The genius of such guidance, if it existed, lies in its deniability. It leaves no proof and requires no consensus. Scholars debate whether such an approach could have originated at the top. Some argue that only central leadership could produce such coherence without documentation. Others counter that coherence emerges naturally in disciplined systems under shared pressure. You do not need a final speech if everyone is watching the same storm clouds. You need only a shared understanding of what matters most. You also consider what is conspicuously absent from the reconstructed picture. There is no evidence of a directive to hide treasure, no proof of coordinated flight routes, no sign of a preserved chain of command beyond the arrests. This absence undermines the more romantic theories that have flourished in the vacuum. Whatever the final instructions were, they were pragmatic rather than grand. They aimed to reduce loss, not to secure victory. There is a faint, almost tired humor in this realization. After centuries of speculation, the most plausible answer is also the least dramatic. The final instructions may have been nothing more than an institutional shrug in the face of danger. Do what you can. Protect what defines us. Accept that not everyone will be spared. You think back to Paris, deliberately unchanged? That too fits. Someone had to absorb the blow. Someone had to look normal. Someone had to be there when the knock came so that others might not be. This is not conspiracy. It is triage, the kind institutions perform without admitting they are doing it. An unresolved scholarly question remains. Did those who issued or embodied these final instructions believe they would be remembered? Or did they assume that silence would swallow everything? The lack of any attempt to record their actions suggests the latter. They did not write for history. They acted for survival. History was someone else's problem. As you assemble these fragments, the final instructions begin to take form, not as words, but as priorities. Preserve memory over appearance. Preserve people over buildings. Preserve continuity over confrontation. These are not commands you need to issue explicitly in an order like the Templars. They are assumptions already woven into the fabric of the institution. There is also the question of failure. Whatever was decided did not save the order. It did not prevent arrest. It did not preserve unity. That failure is real and undeniable. But it may not have been the objective. If the objective was to ensure that the order did not vanish entirely in a single morning, then the uneven outcomes, the lingering questions, and the unresolved gaps suggest partial success. You feel the story slowing, now settling into its final shape. The mystery you began with is no longer about a missing document. It is about a missing moment of articulation. The last orders were not spoken clearly enough to survive. They were embedded in habit, tone, and timing. They did their work, and then disappeared, leaving behind only effects. As you stand at this threshold, The temptation is to declare certainty, to name the instructions, to write them down at last. But doing so would betray the very nature of what you are studying. These final decisions were powerful because they were unspecific. They allowed adaptation. They allowed discretion. They allowed some to endure while others fell. The reconstruction you arrive at is therefore incomplete by design. It respects the silence rather than filling it. And in doing so, it brings you as close as you can come to the truth. The last orders were not meant to be remembered. They were meant to be followed once quietly and then forgotten. You are now standing at the point where inference becomes synthesis. Not certainty, not revelation, something quieter and far more honest. If the final orders existed, they did not arrive as a single command delivered at a single moment. Everything you have traced suggests something else entirely. A sequence, a chain. Each link small enough to appear ordinary on its own, yet strong enough together to shape outcomes across an entire institution. This is where historians, even those who disagree on interpretation, begin to converge. Whatever happened before October 1307 unfolded gradually through accumulation rather than decree. Begin with pressure. The crown tightens, the court stiffens, couriers move more urgently, ecclesiastical voices fall silent. These are not messages, but conditions. In response, leadership emphasizes discipline, safeguarding obedience. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be intercepted. Just a shift in tone that gives permission to take unease seriously. This is a well-established pattern in hierarchical systems under threat, and the Templars show it clearly. From there, local judgment takes over. Houses assess their exposure. Commanders decide whether to remain visible or step aside. Records are maintained until they are not. Assets are left until they should no longer be. No two responses are identical, yet they rhyme. This is not chaos. It is distributed decision-making within a shared framework. Scholars often struggle with this because it resists centralized explanation. But resistance does not equal absence. An obscure but important insight emerges when you consider what is never attempted. There is no effort to rally publicly, no appeal to popular support, no attempt to confront the king directly before the arrests. This silence suggests acceptance of imbalance. The order recognizes that confrontation would hasten destruction. Preservation, if possible at all, must be quiet. You recall Paris deliberately unchanged. That choice now appears essential to the chain. Someone must remain at the center to absorb attention. Someone must confirm the king's expectations. That role prevents scrutiny from drifting outward too quickly. It buys time elsewhere, even if only days. In a system racing information, days matter. The chain continues with selective withdrawal, not flight, not escape in the romantic sense, simply not being where danger will soon be concentrated. Leaders delay returns. Delegation becomes convenient. Absence masquerades as routine. When arrests begin, the king's net closes on what is visible and stationary. What is mobile and peripheral is harder to grasp. This is not brilliance. It is physics. Scholars debate whether such a chain requires conscious design. Some argue yes, pointing to coherence. Others argue no, pointing to inconsistency. The truth likely sits between. The chain does not require a mastermind. It requires shared experience, shared values, and shared perception of risk. In institutions like the Templars, that is enough. There is a quiet, almost somber humor here. Centuries of speculation search for a dramatic final command, while the most plausible explanation involves no drama at all. Just a series of nods, pauses, and decisions made without insisting they mean anything more than prudence. You also notice what the chain does not include. There is no attempt to preserve the order as an institution in its existing form. No effort to safeguard its name or authority. What is preserved instead is continuity of people memory and practice. That choice reframes the narrative. The final orders, if reconstructed accurately, accept dissolution as likely and focus instead on survival beyond it. An unresolved scholarly question remains. Did those at the top understand how far this chain would go? Did they anticipate complete suppression or hope for negotiation after initial shock? The evidence suggests uncertainty rather than confidence. The chain is designed not for a known outcome but for flexibility across unknown ones. As you step back, the shape becomes clear. The most plausible chain of orders is not a list of instructions, but a progression of permission. Permission to prepare quietly. Permission to adjust locally. Permission to sacrifice visibility. Permission to accept loss. Each link strengthens the next. None requires documentation. This is why the record frustrates. You are looking for commands where there were judgments, for documents where there were habits, for clarity where there was caution. The chain worked precisely because it could not be seized, quoted, or condemned. By the time dawn arrives on October 13th, the chain has already done what it can do. It has not saved the order. It has not prevented suffering. It has simply ensured that the end is not absolute. Something moves beyond the moment, unrecorded and unresolved. As the arrests conclude and the narrative hardens into accusation and trial, the chain dissolves. Its work is finished. There is nothing left to instruct. Those who remain must endure openly. Those who do not must remain silent. You are left not with a document, but with a structure of action. And that perhaps is the most honest answer history can offer. The final orders were never meant to be found. They were meant to be followed once quietly and then replaced by silence. Now the story loosens its grip. Not because it has been solved, but because it no longer needs to struggle. After the arrests, after the trials begin, after confessions are extracted and recanted and extracted again, something very specific does not happen. Those who avoid capture do not write memoirs. They do not send letters explaining themselves. They do not preserve an account of how they survived, or why they were absent, or what they were told in those final days. History does not receive a coda. It receives silence. That silence is the last clue. Men who survive dramatic events often speak later, even if only to justify themselves. Here there is nothing. No preserved explanation. No defensive narrative. No quiet confession slipped into a monastery chronicle. Just disappearance into ordinary life, into other orders, into paperwork that no longer marks them as exceptional. Survival in this case does not demand to be remembered. You might expect secrecy to loosen once danger passes. Instead, it hardens. The habits that allowed quiet adjustment before the arrests become the habits of living afterward. Say little, write less, blend in. In a world where attention destroys, anonymity becomes a form of refuge. Silence is no longer tactical, it is permanent. This is where the mystery finally exhales. If the last orders existed, they achieved something paradoxical. They ensured that nothing definitive would survive to explain them. No document to condemn, no instruction to reinterpret, no testimony to distort. The absence is not an accident of time. It is the natural outcome of decisions that prioritized survival over legacy. You do not explain yourself if explanation can still hurt you. And so centuries later, you are left with effects rather than intentions, with gaps rather than statements. With orderly rooms, incomplete records, missing leaders, calm confessions, uneven outcomes. Each piece points in the same direction without ever arriving. The silence is not empty. It is crowded with choices that refused to announce themselves. As the noise of accusation fades in your mind, the story becomes softer, slower. What remains is not conspiracy or treasure or lost power. What remains is restraint. The decision not to act dramatically, not to resist loudly, not to leave behind a final speech for history to admire or dissect. You can rest here in that quiet. The arrests of 1307 feel loud because they were meant to be. They reshaped institutions, law, and memory. But the responses that mattered most were the ones that did not echo. They passed through the moment and vanished, leaving behind only the faintest outline, just enough to trouble anyone who looks closely. There is nothing more to uncover. No final revelation waiting in an archive. The silence after survival is the ending. It tells you that the last orders were never meant to outlive their moment. They were meant to move people just far enough, just quietly enough, and then disappear completely. And so the story does what it has always done best. It fades, not into darkness, into quiet.